Flowers were still in the vase when Serena found the texts. She hadn't been snooping. That wasn't her style. She'd only picked up Brandon's phone because hers was charging in the bedroom, and she needed to check the restaurant reservation for their anniversary dinner, 7 years, and she'd made the reservation herself because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who remembered, the kind who showed up. The phone unlocked with her thumb by accident. His passcode was her birthday. Had always been her birthday. That first message read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." The second, "When are you telling her?" The third was a photo. Serena didn't look at it long, but she looked long enough. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter, face down, very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped working right. Then she stood there in the kitchen she'd renovated herself, the subway tile she'd spent 3 weekends choosing, the open shelving she'd sanded and stained, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. The anniversary cake was still in its pink box on the counter. Chocolate ganache, his favorite. She'd driven 40 minutes to that bakery because it was the only place in Atlanta that made it the way he liked. She left it there and walked into the living room and sat down on the couch and didn't move for a long time. Brandon came home at 6:30 with a bottle of Malbec and a look on his face that she now understood completely. Not guilt. Relief. The particular relief of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. He never got the chance to choose his moment. "How long?" Serena said. Not a question. He stopped in the doorway. The wine bottle hung at his side. "Serena, how long, Brandon?" He put the wine on the entry table, took off his jacket, and then, because Brandon Alcott had never once in 11 years done anything the easy way, he sat down across from her and told her the truth. 8 months. Her name was Priya. She worked at the architecture firm across the street from his office. They'd met at a conference in Charlotte. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said, "on our anniversary. I know how that sounds. Do you?" He had the decency not to answer that. What came next was the kind of conversation that hollows you out from the inside. Brandon was not cruel about it. That was almost worse. The careful, measured way he explained that he'd felt disconnected for years, that he'd tried to find his way back to her, that he hoped she could eventually understand. Serena sat very still and listened to her husband explain why she wasn't enough, and she thought about the 14-hour days she put in building his company's brand identity from nothing. She thought about the investor pitch deck she designed at 2 in the morning while he slept. She thought about the year she'd turned down a senior position at a firm in New York because he'd said Atlanta was where their future was. She thought about all of it, and she said nothing. When he finished, she stood up. "You should sleep in the guest room," she said. "I'll need some time to get my things together." He looked surprised. She wasn't sure what he'd expected. Tears, maybe. Screaming. Something that would have let him leave feeling like he was the reasonable one. "Serena, you don't have to leave. This is your home too." "I know that," she said. "I'll be in touch through my attorney." She was 41 years old. She had a master's degree in graphic design and a decade of work poured into a man who had just told her, very politely, that she was no longer necessary. She called her sister Diane that night from a hotel room in Midtown and said the words out loud for the first time. "He's been seeing someone else." And then she lay on her back on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and made herself a promise that she would cry exactly once. Right now, tonight, in this room. And then she would be done with it. She cried for 2 hours. Then she washed her face. Then she washed her lace off in her laptop and started making a list. The divorce proceedings began in February, 3 weeks after Brandon moved Priya into the house that Serena had not yet legally vacated because her attorney, a woman named Paulette Harris, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the disposition of someone who had seen everything twice, advised her to stay put. "Document everything," Paulette said at their first meeting, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Every contribution you made to his business ventures, every financial decision you were part of, every asset acquired during the marriage. I want receipts, emails, contracts, and your own written account of any verbal agreements." Serena had brought a folder. Then another folder. Then a portable hard drive. Paulette looked at it all and allowed herself a small smile. Brandon's attorney was a man named Clifford who wore expensive suits and specialized in making wives disappear quietly, with minimum payout. He was very good at his job. He was also not prepared for Serena. The issue was the firm. Brandon had launched Alcott Creative Solutions 4 years into their marriage, with $40,000 of combined savings, a business plan that Serena had written, and a logo she had designed. She had spent the first 2 years of the company's existence doing the creative work of 3 people while working her own freelance clients on the side, because they couldn't afford to pay her a salary yet. She had no formal employment contract, no equity stake in writing, no title. Brandon had always said they'd formalize it later. Later, it turned out, was never. Clifford presented this as a simple matter of documentation. There was none naming Serena as a partner or stakeholder. The business was Brandon's. Her contributions had been those of a supportive spouse. Paulette let him finish. Then she opened the first folder. There were the original business registration documents, with Serena's handwriting in the margins. There were email chains from 2017 showing her negotiating the firm's first major client contract. There were invoices under her name for design work the company had been compensated for without compensating her. There were testimonials from 3 early clients who specifically credited her work for bringing them to Alcott Creative Solutions. There were photographs from a 2019 industry award ceremony where Brandon had accepted an award for a campaign that Serena had conceptualized, executed, and presented. She'd been in the audience. There was also a contract Serena had found in a filing cabinet at home, a contract from 2018 that Brandon had apparently forgotten about, in which he'd agreed, in writing, to transfer 15% equity to Serena upon formalization of partnership structure. The structure had never been formalized. The contract had never been voided. Clifford asked for a recess. Outside the conference room, Brandon found Serena in the hallway and said quietly, "Where did you find that?" "The house," she said. "My house, where I still live." "Serena, we can work this out between us. You don't need to do this." "I'm not doing anything," she said. "I'm just answering questions honestly." She went back in and sat down and folded her hands on the table, and when the session resumed she answered every question Paulette asked in a clear, steady voice, and she did not look at Brandon once. Spring came and the case dragged on the way divorce cases do, in increments, with delays and motions and counter-motions, and Serena found herself with more time on her hands than she'd had in years. She started running again. She started cooking elaborate meals for one and finding, to her surprise, that she liked it. She called Diane every Sunday and slowly, haltingly, started to feel like herself again. Not the version of herself that had existed in relation to Brandon, but something older and more essential that she packed away a long time ago without noticing. It was Diane who told her about Marcus. "He's back in Atlanta," Diane said in the careful tone of someone delivering information they know is loaded. "Opened his own firm. You knew him from Emory, right?" She had known Marcus Webb from Emory. They'd been in the same design program, had spent a semester working on a joint project, had shared the kind of creative shorthand that takes years to build with most people, and had come naturally between them in about 2 weeks. They'd lost touch after graduation the way people do. Different cities, different trajectories. She'd heard, eventually, that he'd gone to San Francisco, built a reputation in tech branding, done well. She ran into him at an industry mixer in April, the kind of event she'd stopped going to when she became Brandon's wife, and was trying to start attending again now that she was simply herself. He was standing by the bar looking at his phone with the particular expression of someone who has been dragged to an event they didn't want to attend. "Marcus," she said. He looked up, and then he smiled. The real kind, not the professional kind, and said, "Serena, it's been a long time." They stood in the corner for 2 hours and talked about work, about Atlanta, about the industry, and what it had become, and it was the first conversation in months that had felt completely uncomplicated. No subtext, no careful navigation, just 2 people who used to know each other well finding out they still did. She drove home that night and caught herself humming and then sat with that for a moment, because it was a small thing, but small things had started to mean a lot. She didn't see Brandon in person until June, at the courthouse for a preliminary hearing that Paulette had warned her would likely be contentious. Brandon arrived with Clifford and an expression that managed to be simultaneously wounded and entitled, which had always been one of his particular talents. He looked at her across the hallway and she knew immediately that he'd heard about Marcus. Atlanta was not as large a city as it liked to think it was, and the design world was smaller still. She and Marcus had had dinner twice, coffee once, and had collaborated on a pitch that his firm had invited her to contribute to. Professional, completely straightforward. But the look on Brandon's face was not the look of a man with any interest in the distinction. Inside the hearing room, Clifford argued for a revaluation of the 2018 contract, suggesting it had been signed under conditions that rendered it non-binding. Paulette dismantled this argument with what Serena had come to recognize as her characteristic economy. No flourishes, no drama, just precise, documented fact laid carefully in front of the judge. Brandon stared at the table. After the hearing, standing outside on the courthouse steps, he appeared at her elbow. "So Marcus Webb," he said. "Excuse me? You didn't waste any time." Serena looked at him for a moment. The man she had loved for 11 years. The man who had spent 8 of those months building a second life while she cooked dinner and renewed their lease and made anniversary reservations at a restaurant they never got to. "Brandon," she said, "you ended our marriage. What I do now is not your business. He's my competitor, Serena. You know that. I know that you two are both in the same industry. I also know that has nothing to do with me." He looked like he wanted to say something else. Paulette materialized at Serena's side with the timing of someone who had been watching. "Ms. Whitmore," she said pleasantly, "we should discuss next steps." Serena walked away. Brandon stood on the courthouse steps, and she did not turn around. The thing nobody tells you about rebuilding is how unglamorous it is. There's no montage. There's just the regular accumulation of days, some better and some worse, and the slow, quiet work of figuring out who you are when no one is watching. Serena sublet a studio near Ponce City Market and set up her workspace by the window and started taking her own clients again, the ones she'd let go gradually over the years as Brandon's company had taken up more and more of her time. She was rusty in some ways and sharper in others. She understood now exactly what her work was worth. Marcus called one Thursday morning with what he described as a situation. His firm had been shortlisted for the rebranding of a mid-sized hotel group. 15 properties, national footprint, serious budget. They'd made the final 3. The client wanted a presentation in 6 weeks. "I want you on this," he said, "not as a favor, because you're the best person for the visual language piece and you know it." She did know it as it happened. She said yes. The 6 weeks that followed were the most engaged she'd felt professionally in years. She and Marcus worked well together, the way she'd remembered. Complementary instincts, no ego battles, a shared understanding that good work was the point. She came home some nights exhausted and satisfied in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. They won the account. The client announcement came with a small industry write-up in a trade publication. A brief mention of Web Creative's win, with Serena named as lead designer on the visual identity. The kind of small professional notice that most people in the industry scroll past. Brandon did not scroll past it. She found out about his reaction through Diane, who had heard it from someone who worked at Alcott Creative Solutions and had apparently witnessed Brandon throwing the trade publication across his office. Alcott Creative had also been shortlisted for that account. They had not made the final 3. She allowed herself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction. Then she went back to work. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in August, which was an ordinary day, overcast, with the particular Atlanta humidity that makes the air feel like something you have to push through. Serena sat in Paulette's office afterward and signed the last of the paperwork and then sat very still for a moment. "You did well," Paulette said. The settlement included a fair division of marital assets, a lump sum payment reflecting her documented contributions to Alcott Creative Solutions, and the acknowledgement, in writing, on record, that the 2018 contract had been valid. Brandon had not wanted to give any of it. He had given all of it because the alternative was a trial that Clifford had quietly advised him he would likely lose. She took herself to dinner that night, alone, at a restaurant she'd always wanted to try and had never gotten around to because it wasn't Brandon's kind of place. She ordered what she wanted. She had a glass of good wine. She sat by the window and watched the city she'd lived in for 15 years and thought about what came next. Marcus texted while she was finishing her dessert, heard from Paulette. "Congratulations. Dinner this week to celebrate?" She smiled at her phone in the quiet restaurant the way you smile when something feels right rather than complicated. Then she typed back, "Thursday. I'll pick the place this time." What Serena heard, later, in the way that you hear things in a city like Atlanta where everyone knows someone who knows someone, was that Priya had left Brandon by September. She'd heard different versions of why. The version that seemed most consistent was that Priya had not signed up for the version of Brandon that existed post-divorce. the distracted, bitter version who tracked Serena's professional activities with an attention he'd never paid to anything during their actual marriage. That Priya had said, more than once, that she felt like she was competing with a woman who wasn't even in the room. Serena heard this and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter. The recognition that she'd been right to walk away cleanly, to build her own thing, to resist the temptation to look back. She heard also that Brandon had been passed over for a major contract, a government commission he'd been pursuing for 2 years, and that the firm had lost 2 senior designers in the same quarter. That Alcott Creative Solutions was smaller now than it had been. That Brandon had been spotted at industry events looking tired. She did not go out of her way to confirm any of this. She was busy. She and Marcus took things slowly, the way people in their 40s sometimes do, with their eyes open, with the understanding that time is not something to waste and also not something to rush. He knew her history and she knew his, and neither of them pretended to be anything other than what they were. 2 people who had done the work of figuring themselves out and were choosing, now, to figure out something together. There was a night in October when they were working late on a proposal at his office, and he brought her coffee without being asked, and she looked up from her screen at him across the room. Completely ordinary moment, lamplight. The city outside the window going dark, and something settled in her chest that she recognized as peace. She thought about Brandon sometimes. Not often, not with longing. Occasionally with a kind of distant sorrow for the people they'd been and the years they'd spent not quite seeing each other. But mostly she thought about forward. The hotel account, the clients she was building back up, the possibility of a partnership with Marcus that they'd begun to discuss in terms more serious than professional. Brandon had believed that letting her go was getting rid of something that was slowing him down. He had not understood what he'd had until it was gone, and then he'd spent months proving it, publicly and increasingly desperately, in ways that had cost him more than the divorce ever did. Serena Whitmore had spent 11 years making someone else's life look good. She had spent 1 year making her own. She thought sometimes that the difference was something she could spend a long time being grateful for. The coffee Marcus brought her was exactly how she liked it. No sugar, just a little cream. And she thought that was, in the end, what it came down to. Someone who paid attention. Someone who showed up. Someone who knew the small things and treated them like they mattered. She turned back to her work. Outside the window, Atlanta glittered in the dark, indifferent and alive, the way cities are. And Serena was in it, and she was exactly where she wanted to be.